Okay, I want to welcome you to our Bible study tonight. We're looking at a prophecy update. We're taking a break from Acts just for 1 week. And there's so much going on in the world, it's just hard to ignore it. And if we look at what's going on in the Middle East, why is Israel such a big deal? Why is so much attention focused on Israel right now? And it's just one of many nations in the world, but it has to do with God. And if we look at some of the Bible verses here, this will help us to understand. In Genesis 17:6, God's speaking about Israel now, and his people. He says, I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings will come forth from you. In 17:7, he says, I will establish my covenant between me and you and your descendants after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your descendants after you. In other words, God looked down on the world, and he has a plan. He wants the world to come to know him. And of all the nations, he's going to choose Abram, and he's going to choose Israel to be his people. He could have chosen anybody he wanted, but this is what he's done. And in Genesis 17:8, he says, I will give to you and to your descendants after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. So God, when he makes his covenant, you could read more about it, but he gives the land and a blessing of prosperity to the people, to Abraham's descendants. And not everybody has been happy about that. Isaiah chapter 42, or 43, verse 1 and 2, God continues and he says, It is I who have declared and saved and proclaimed, and there was no strange God among you. So you are my witnesses, declares the Lord, and I am God. Even from eternity I am he, and there is no one who can deliver out of my hand. I act, and who can reverse it? In other words, God is saying, I want the world to know about me, and I'm going to make you, Israel, Abram's descendants, my witnesses. And there is no doubt that that's what his plan is, and that's their main goal or mission. In Isaiah 41, verse 8, we read, But you, Israel, my servant, Jacob who I have chosen, descendant of Abraham, my friend, you whom I have taken from the ends of the earth and called from the remotest parts, and said, You are my servant. I have chosen you and not rejected you. Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not anxiously look about you, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. Surely I will help you. Surely I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. And behold, all those who are angered at you will be shamed and dishonored. Those who contend with you will be as nothing and will perish. So here we see there's going to be people that are going to come against God's people. They don't want what God's planning and what he's doing. There's going to be contention, but God is not going to be denied. 2 Chronicles 33, verse 4 through 7. He built altars in the house of the Lord, which the Lord had said, My name shall be in Jerusalem forever. Then he put the carved image of the idol which he had made in the house of God, which God had said to David, to Solomon's son, In this house and in Jerusalem, which I have chosen from all the tribes of the earth, I will put my name forever. So you wonder, why is it that the Middle East is such a big deal? It seems to always be in the news. God says, I have chosen from all the tribes of Israel in Jerusalem, and I will put my name forever. And God has said, this is my city, this is my spot, and I could have chosen anywhere in the world, but this is the spot I've chosen. So naturally, that's where the enemies of God are going to come against him. And there's one more thing I want to put here. In Amos chapter 9, verse 14 and 15, Also I will restore the captivity of my people Israel, and they will rebuild ancient cities, the ruined cities, and live in them. And they will also plant vineyards and drink their wine, and make gardens and then eat their fruit. In other words, we get a picture here that in the last days, Israel's going to be prosperous. And he says, then I will also plant them on their land, and they will not again be rooted out from their land, which I have given them, says the Lord your God. So here God says, look, I'm going to put my people in their land, the land that I gave them, and I'm going to make them prosperous. I'm going to bless them. They're going to prosper in many ways, and I will not allow them to be uprooted again. So when we look at this, if the enemies of Israel would put any faith and trust in the God of the Bible, they would read this, they would know they're wasting their time. All those people that are coming against Israel right now, they are all going to lose. Doesn't matter how much money they spend, how many plans they make, they're going to come to naught because God will not be denied. That's what he said. And we want to just take 1 second here and stop and say, where are we in history? You know, is this the end? Is this the beginning of the end? Or is this the beginning of the end of the beginning? You know, it's a hard way to look at history and see what's going on. But God has an easy way for us to tell time. He has an hour hand on his clock, and that's Israel. He has a minute hand on his clock, and that's Jerusalem. And he has a second hand on his clock, which is the Temple Mount. If you want to know what's going on and how God is in history, look at the Temple Mount, look at God's holy city, Jerusalem, and look at Israel to see how they're doing. And right now, there's a lot of trouble there. Now, if we look again, trying to figure out why things are the way they are and how God has planned for this, we'll look at Genesis chapter 16, verse 8 through 12, and we begin to get a little picture again of understanding here. And this is Abraham. He had a wife, Sarah, who couldn't bear a child. And so the custom of that day was your wife's handmaiden could raise up a child for you instead to be your heir. And Hagar, Sarah's maid, says, where have you come from and where are you going? And she said, I am fleeing from the presence of my mistress, Sarai. Then the angel Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her authority. Moreover, the angel of the Lord said to her, I will multiply greatly your descendants so that they will be too many to count. So who are the descendants of Hagar? They're the Arabs, the descendants of Ishmael. And the angel of the Lord said to her further, behold, you are with child, and you will bear a son, and you shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has given heed to your affliction. He will be, and this is not my opinion. This is what the Bible says, and you can't argue with what God says, even though it might not be what you would like to hear. Genesis 16:12. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him, and he will live to the east of his brothers. So if you look in the Middle East right now, and you look at the relationships between the Arabs and the Jews, the descendants of Abraham's two sons, Isaac and Ishmael, they are against one another. That's just the nature of the situation. That's the way God has made them. He will be a wild donkey of a man. I don't know if you've ever tried to lead a donkey that didn't want to go some way. You can fight all you want. They can be the most stubborn, obstinate creatures ever. And that's interesting that God would pick that picture of Ishmael. That doesn't mean he doesn't love those descendants. Absolutely he does. Does he want them to come to know him and be in his kingdom forever? Yes, he does. Does he love them less than he loves the Jews? No. but he's chosen the Jews for a special purpose, and it seems like the adversary is always bringing somebody against him. And if we look now just quickly for a second here, what does that look like when someone, a nation, or a people group comes against Israel or the Jews? What does that look like? Well, just in basically my lifetime, when God reestablished Israel in the land in 1948, we've had a number of wars. In Ezekiel 37, God says, I'm going to reestablish my people. And when he does, not everybody's going to be happy about it. In just the last 75 years, there's been the War of Independence in 1948 and 49. There's been the Suez War in 1956. The Six-Day War in 1967. The War of Attrition in 1967 to 70. The Yom Kippur War in 1973. Remember, Yom is day in Hebrew. Kippur is atonement. The Day of Atonement War, 1973. The Lebanese War, 1982. The First Arab Intifada, 1987 to 1993. There was the First Gulf War in 1991. There was a Second Arab Intifada in 2000 to 2004. There was a Hezbollah War. Now the Hezbollah are basically in Lebanon, again funded by Iran, so they're enemies to the north in Lebanon of Israel. Hezbollah War, 2006. The 11 on our list here, Hamas War, 2008, 2009. And then we have now. We have the war that's going on right now. And if we look at Revelation chapter 16, verse 13 through 16, let me look that up here. We get a picture of what God is talking about here. Revelation 16. Verse 13. And I saw coming out of the mouth of the dragon, out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet, 3 unclean spirits, like frogs, for they are spirits of demons, performing signs which go out to the kings, which made kings of the world, to gather them together for the war of the great day of God, the Almighty. Behold, I'm coming like a thief. Blessed is the one who stays awake and keeps his clothes, so that he will not walk about naked, and they will not see his shame. And they will gather them together in the place which in Hebrew is called Armageddon. Now we see that phrase all the time, Armageddon. It's even in movies they have titles like Snowmageddon. You know, it's the picture of some horrible, awful disaster that's coming. And what actually Armageddon means, it comes from the Hebrew Har, which means hill or mountain, and Mageddon, which means crowds. So the place in Israel, there is a plain that's called the Plains of Armageddon, and it's actually the hill or the mountain of crowds. It's not a big mountain, it's a low hill, but it's where the armies are going to gather together against Israel in the last days. There's going to be a gigantic battle there. We're not there yet, but we're working our way there. In Matthew 24, verse 32 through 34, again, Jesus is describing on the Mount of Olives. He's describing what's coming. And this is his longest message, prophetic message, and he's explaining a lot of what's coming on in the future. Matthew 24, verse 32 through 34. open. Looking in Acts, and that's not going to work. Okay, here we go. Matthew 24:34. Now learn the parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. The fig tree is a picture of Israel. And God uses that throughout the scripture to talk about his people. When he says, when the leaves are tender, in other words, when the fig tree is coming alive, you know the end is near. So too, you know, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near, is right at the door. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will not pass away. My words will not pass away. There's a lot of ways you can look at some of what these prophetic phrases mean. But when he says this generation will not pass away, that can be race, like a people group won't pass away, or it can actually be those people who are alive at the time that they see the fig tree bloom. Now, if you take me, for instance, I was born in 1949. Israel became a nation in 1948. All these things that have happened in Israel, these wars, have happened in my lifetime. And we don't know exactly when the Lord's going to come back, but he does say, this nation will not pass away. In other words, it's possible that in my lifetime, I'm going to see this prophecy fulfilled, and what that would mean is that Christ would return during my lifetime. And if you look at all these things are really speeding up. When Jesus says in Revelation, I'm coming quickly, the word quickly in Greek is tachios, and it's where we get the word tachometer from. In other words, things are speeding up. If you look just since Israel's become a nation, how many wars they've had and what's going on now, because the conflict that's raging right now could become much bigger, much wider. Is it the end? Well, we'll talk about that in a minute. So let's go to Psalm 83, verse 1 through 8, because what we're looking at here Psalm 83, 1 through 8, there are two main wars in the future that are described in the Bible. And Psalms 83 is one of them. In Psalm 83, 1 through 8, we read, this is a psalm of Asaph. Now, Asaph is the seer. Seer means a prophet. So Asaph, the prophet, is giving us this in Psalms. O God, do not remain silent. Do not be silent, and O God, do not be still. For behold, your enemies make an uproar, and those who hate you have exalted themselves. They make shrewd plans against your people, and conspire together against your treasured ones. They have said, come and let us wipe them out as a nation, that the name of Israel be remembered no more. For they have conspired together with one mind against you to make a covenant. The tents of Edom and the Ishmaelites, Moab and the Hagrites. Now what we're seeing here is a battle against God's people. Asaph says, these guys are going to come against you. And he describes actually who they're going to be. In modern terms, they're Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, and Gaza. And when have all these nations, when have they all come together against Israel? Well, it's not right now, is it? Because Jordan and Egypt, for instance, are not coming against Israel. So the Psalm 83 war can't be what's going on right now, because we know who the players are. But they were all lined up. This alignment took place at the War of Independence in 48 and 49. So the Psalm 83 war has most likely already taken place. And if you look at verse 5, it says, they have conspired together with one mind against you. They make a covenant. In the Psalm 83 war, the people are lying against God. They made God their enemy. Sure, they're fighting with Israel and the Jews, but their battle is really against God. And at the end of this, if you read the Psalms, every so often you see the word Selah in there. Selah means stop and pause and think about it. In other words, when these nations are to come against God, as Asaph says they will, pause and think about it. This is a serious thing. This is something to really consider. And that could have easily happened 75 years ago or so at the War of Independence. And there's one more war that's described in the Bible, and that's the Ezekiel 38 war. Are we there yet? Well, let's look and see what it says. Ezekiel 38 war, verse 1 through 8. And the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, set your face against Gog of the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshach, and Tubal, and prophesy against him. Now Gog is some kind of a figurehead. You could say pharaoh or king or whatever. He's the leader of what's going on here. And thus says the Lord God, behold, I'm against you, O Gog, prince of Rosh, Meshach, and Tubal. Now we don't know exactly who Rosh, Meshach, and Tubal. A lot of people speculate that it's Russia and that's Moscow and Tobolsk, their Western and Eastern capitals, but that is just speculation. In verse 4, I will turn you about and put hooks into your jaws, and I will bring you out, and all your army, horses and horsemen, all of them splendidly attired, a great company with buckler and shield, all of them wielding swords. When he says he's going to put hook in their mouths, we think, this is a horrible thing, that, God didn't prepare for what's going on, or somehow he's being caught off guard by all the battles and people that have come against his nation, Israel. But no, actually, God is in charge of this. He's putting a hook in the mouth of those people who are coming against Israel, and he's bringing them to the battle. And then in verse 5, he says, Persia, Ethiopia, and put with them, all with shield and helmet, Gomer with all his troops, Beth to Gomorrah from the remote parts of the north with all his troops, many peoples with you. Be prepared and prepare yourself, you and all your companies that are assembled about you, and be a guard for them. After many days you'll be summoned. In the latter years, now this tells us when this battle is going to take place. It's not in the middle of history. This is at the end of an age. This is at the end of all things here. In the latter years you will come into the land that is restored from the sword, whose inhabitants have been gathered from many nations to the mountains of Israel, which have been a continual waste. And if you look at Israel, it was a completely devastated land when Israel got permission to return and reestablish themselves there. But its people were brought out from the nations, and they're living securely, all of them. And in fact, in verse 11, it says, in unwalled villages. Now, we don't know exactly what all this means, but Israel right now, in this last, say, 20 years or so, they have been living in cities that are unwalled villages. In fact, the inhabitants of Israel in their little communities were not even armed. They depended on the military to provide protection for them. Now they did have a secure border, which obviously was breached this last couple weeks, but they were living in relative peace and safety, and not worried about anything. Today, they're all arming themselves. It's not just the military, it's every little city and community is providing its own little militia so that if something happens, they won't be defenseless, which is what happened just a few weeks ago. We said they were in unwalled villages in verse 11 of Ezekiel 38. I will go up against the land of unwalled villages. I will go against those who are at rest, that live securely, all living without walls and having no bars or gates. So that's kind of the picture of what we just saw. Now, I'm not saying this is Ezekiel 38, but it could be working that way, because there's some things that we haven't yet seen, which the Bible talks about. In Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, Daniel is given a prophecy about the future. And in 26, he says, and after the 62 weeks, in other words, Gabriel gives Daniel, in answer to his prayer, a timeline of the future. And Gabriel says, after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing. Now, the Messiah, this is the first coming, or the advent of Jesus Christ. He's the Messiah, and he's going to be cut off and have nothing. Now, that nothing can also be translated cut off, but not for himself. In other words, the cut off is a euphemism. Every Jew knows what that means. It means you're going to be killed, but not for yourself. In other words, Jesus Christ did not die for anything he'd done. He died for the sins of the world, for us, to atone for what we'd done. And the people of the prince who's to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. And its end will come with a flood. Even to the end there will be war, and desolations are determined. Now we could spend a couple weeks just on this verse. What all does this mean? The prince who's to come, ultimately, it's not just Titus, who was the one who destroyed the city in 70 AD, but ultimately there is an Antichrist. Anti doesn't mean against Christ, it means in the place of Christ. There's someone coming who's going to pretend and take the place of Christ, and when he comes, there's going to be a lot of trouble. It says desolations determined. In verse 27, it says, and he will make a firm covenant. Now this is this coming prince, the one who's in the place of Christ. He's going to make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week. In the prophecy that Daniel's given, there was 70 weeks of years that God's people were given to do a list of things, and you could look back and read that. But 69 weeks of years came to pass, and the Messiah was cut off. And there's still 1 week of years. There's 7 years left in this prophecy. Now, there's a big space that's happened between the 69th and 70th week. But in the middle of this last week, when it does begin to take place again, he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering. And on the wing of abominations will come who makes desolate, even a complete destruction. One that is decreed is poured out on the one who makes desolate. Now we could look at what the abomination of desolation is. Jesus mentions it in Matthew 24, referring back here in Daniel. And if we look in 1 Thessalonians, this is described again. 1 and 2 Thessalonians talks about the return of Christ and what it will be like, the rapture and the Antichrist coming to power. And all this is still future. We haven't seen that yet, but we will. And when the Messiah is cut off in Daniel, and this false prince, this anti-Christ prince comes to power, he's going to reign for this 7-year period. Now, when he says he makes a firm covenant with many, he's going to make some kind of an agreement with Israel that's going to promise and provide peace. And at first, there will be peace. But in the middle of the week, the 3.5 years in, he's going to go into the temple, which tells you that the temple in Jerusalem, which isn't there now, is going to be rebuilt. And he's going to declare himself God. and demand to be worshipped. And if you don't worship him, you'll be put to death. And where is he going to seat himself in the temple? If you've ever looked at any pictures of the temple, in temples in history, there are no chairs, there are no benches in there. There's only one place to sit in the temple, and that's the mercy seat, which is above the Ark of the Covenant. So what this false prince is going to do, he's going to take the mercy seat, which is, it's like stealing Christ's thunder, and sit on the very place that the blood was shed for the sins of the nation, and declare himself to be God and be worshipped. And that is obviously still coming. Is it coming right away? It doesn't look like it. But the way things are going, it could work into that pretty fast. The gap between 69th and 70th week is something that people would say, well, how do we know that there's in the middle of a verse that God's going to put like a pause and put a big space of time in it? He's done that before. If we look at Isaiah 61 verse 2, 61:1, this is Jesus. Now this is the prophecy that Jesus is going to fulfill, and we can read that in the New Testament. But this is what Isaiah said: the Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the afflicted. He sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and freedom to the prisoners, to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn. Now this is absolutely an incredible story all by itself. In other words, Jesus is from Nazareth. He returns to Nazareth, and he is an adult male Jew, gets a turn to read the scriptures in the temple in his hometown. And we can read about this in the New Testament. What he does is they give him the scroll. Now, if you can imagine, the scroll is rolled up, they unroll it, and they read from it, and every week they just unroll a little bit farther and read again. So they don't turn to it like you're going to flip to a page in the Bible. When they give it to Jesus, it's open to a specific place. Talk about God's timing for history. And Jesus reads from this scroll, but he doesn't read the whole passage. He just reads, bind up the brokenhearted, proclaim liberty to the captives and freedom to the prisoners, to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord. And he stops right in the middle of that verse. And he hands the scroll back, and he sits down and he says, today this verse has been fulfilled in your hearing. Now everybody's stunned because they know he was supposed to keep reading the day of vengeance of our God. But that's the difference between Jesus' first advent and his second advent. The first time he came to bring good news to the afflicted, bind up the brokenhearted, proclaim liberty to the captives. The next time he comes, it will be the day of vengeance of our God. And that's still coming. We may be getting very close to that now when we see what's happening with his people Israel and his country. There's something else I want to add to this. Isaiah 17, verse 1 through 3. This is an oracle. Again, an oracle is like a prophetic word from God. And this is concerning Damascus. Now, if you know where Damascus is on your calendar, it's the capital of Syria. It's pretty near the Golan Heights. It's pretty near Egypt's border on their northeast side. The oracle concerning Damascus: behold, Damascus is about to be removed from being a city and become a fallen ruin. Now, this is pretty interesting because Damascus, if I'm right, hear about this, is the longest inhabited city in the world, continuously inhabited. Damascus is a pretty spectacular place, and it's been a place of civilization for a very long time. But what the oracle says is, the cities of Aroer are forsaken. They will be for flocks to lie down in, and there will be no one to frighten them. The fortified city will disappear from Ephraim, and sovereignty from Damascus. And the remnant of Aram, they will be like the glory of the sons of Israel, declares the Lord of hosts. Damascus is going to be completely destroyed and totally uninhabitable ever again. Now, what does that mean? I don't know. Does that mean there's going to be a giant nuclear blast and there will be so much fallout that no one can ever live there again? Because it's a spectacular spot. And maybe that does mean that. We don't know. But if you look at what's going on, Iran is funding Hezbollah in the north of Israel, and they're funding Hamas in Gaza, and they're also funding the Houthis in Yemen. But the northern part of Israel, because Iran is staging all the military supplies in Damascus that goes to both Hezbollah and Hamas, Israel is continually attacking the supplies as they arrive in Damascus. And so if you look in the news, the Damascus airport's bombed all the time. And there were, anti-missile, there are missiles to prevent Israel from coming in to shoot their planes down, and Israel has to keep taking those out and then bombing the city to destroy the supply chains so that Hamas and Hezbollah don't have more and more weapons to come against Israel with. Iran is a little too far away to attack directly. So they're sending their proxies all the things they need to promote war. And they're funding them with more than just munitions. I just heard this week that Hamas is given $1 billion a year in cash from Iran to supply all their needs. Uniforms, weapons, whatever they need to live on while they're attacking Israel. That's a pretty big funding. And unfortunately, there are some United States congressmen who have helped provide that funding by providing treaties with Iran and allowing them to have money, even from us, which is going right to the terrorist groups, which is just unbelievable. So Damascus is going to be destroyed. And if you want to see where we are in the calendar, if you wake up in the morning and you look at your newspaper and it says Damascus has been obliterated, hang on to your hats, because that's a sign we're right at the very end. In Ezekiel 38:8, it tells us, after many days you'll be summoned. In the latter years you will come into the land that is restored from the sword, whose inhabitants have been gathered from many nations to the mountain of Israel, which have been in continual waste. But its people were brought up from many nations, and they were living securely, all of them. In other words, all this is going to happen in the latter days, at the end of the age, at the end of this time that God has now brought us to. And so, what kind of conclusions can we make from some of this? Are we in the Ezekiel 38 war? No, I don't think so. Right now, Russia and Iran, if you read Ezekiel 38, they align together with Turkey to come against Israel. Right now, Russia's got its hands full in their own little private war, and Iran is pretty much up to their necks right now, supplying stuff for Hezbollah and Hamas. But the time will come when they're going to make some kind of a unified pact against Israel. And they're talking now. How soon that will happen, I don't know. But it could be soon. And interestingly, when we look at the scenarios, in Daniel, when we read in Daniel 9:27, it says the end will come like a flood. In other words, there's this picture of the pressure coming against Israel, and it keeps building and building, and all of a sudden it's just like the dam burst. And I don't think that's an accident that God used that kind of a scenario for us to try and calculate how close we are to the end. And this is something I saw a few years ago, and I've saved it just because I could not really believe it myself when I first looked at it. Things are speeding up. We talked about that. Tachyon. When Jesus said, "Behold, I come quickly," things are speeding up. And what does that look like? If we think about things exponentially, like just in the last 75 years, look at how many separate conflicts have come against Israel. There wasn't anything like that for the previous 1900 years. So let's just take a little picture to try and figure out what an exponential attack against Israel would look like. Imagine a football stadium. In a football stadium, you have an idea how big that is. We've all seen those. And you're going to fill it up with water, and you're going to start with one drop. And every minute, you're going to add water again. Only you're going to double it each time. The first time, it goes from 1 to 2 drops, then 2 to 4 drops, then 4 to 8 drops, 8 to 16 drops. And you think about that, that's hardly anything. How long is it going to take to fill that stadium with water? I've asked people, and they guess. They say, well, a couple days or a week or, maybe a month, whatever. It's hard to think about that. No, if you fill that stadium with water, doubling the drops every minute, it only takes 50 minutes, that's 50 minutes, to entirely fill that stadium. And that's like hard to understand, but even more interestingly, how full is the stadium after 45 minutes? So in 50 minutes, the stadium is completely full of water, starting from 1 drop. But after 45 minutes, how much water is in there? And most people would guess like 75% or 90%, but no. After 45 minutes, the stadium is only 7% full. In the last 5 minutes, the stadium goes from 7% full to 100% full. Now that's a picture of where we are in history and how fast things are going. When Daniel says the end comes like a flood, that's what he's talking about. We have these little battles, they just keep chipping away one after another, but it's going to speed up incredibly, and the end is going to come like a flood. In the last few minutes of history, we're going to see an incredible change in what's going on. So are we at the end? No. Are we close at the end? Yes, we are. How close are we? We don't know that for sure. When we look at Ezekiel, the alliances aren't all there yet in the Ezekiel 38 war. But they could be very soon. So we'll have to see what happens between Russia and Turkey and Iran and Libya and the others that come against Israel. What's interesting is not only the nations that align against Israel, there are some that do not come against Israel in this Ezekiel 38 war. The nations that are mentioned that do not come against Israel, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Jordan. And when you look at those, you think, no, wait a minute, they've always been against Israel. But not at this point in history, not at this battle. And when we think about this, there's one more thing to add here. What does it take to get peace? In Israel, if you speak Hebrew, this is what the modern letters for shalom, which is the word for peace, are. This is what Paleo Hebrew looks like. Shalom. Shin, Lamed, Vav, Mem. And in Paleo Hebrew, those characters have content. They mean something. Shin is a picture of crushing. It's like destruction. That's the teeth biting down on something. Lamed is a picture of the shepherd's staff. That's like the leader, someone's an authority. Vav is like the hook, and it's what connects things together. And interestingly enough, Vav is in Hebrew the word and, connecting what's before and after. And finally, there's Mem. And Mem is an interesting little character. It's a picture of waters, and it could be two things. And you have to decide which one it is, depending on the context. The Mem can be waters of destruction. It can also be waters of peace and blessing. So what does shalom mean? When we see Israelites, they come and go and they all say shalom. And they're saying peace and harmony and wholeness, absence of war. Those are peace and harmony. Those are what they mean when they say shalom. But in the characters of shalom, we see something a little bit different. Shin is crushing, destroying. Lamed is the one in authority. Vav is connecting together, and Mem is chaos and confusion. In other words, in the word shalom, we see that the crushing and destroying of the one in authority, those connected to the chaos and confusion, is where shalom comes from. In other words, you get peace when you have destroyed your enemies. That's when peace comes. And we look at some of these previous wars, what happened with Jordan, and what happened with Saudi Arabia, and what happened with Egypt. They were beaten soundly, and they now have peace with Israel. That's an interesting picture, isn't it? How are we going to get peace in the rest of the Middle East? I think it's only going to come through a severe and complete destruction of their enemies. That's what shalom really means. So when we say, pray for the peace of Jerusalem, that's a good thing to do. In fact, in Psalms it tells us we should be doing that. But that peace is only going to come at the end of a conflict. And so what we need to do is pray more than ever for those in Israel and those associated with Israel. There are a lot of people who were taken captive by Hamas. They were not just Jews. There were people from around the world that were visiting Israel that were taken into captivity. We need to pray for all of them. And Israel is going to make every attempt not only to rescue them, but to destroy those who are coming against their country in the way they have. If you've ever prayed for the peace of Jerusalem, this would be a time to knuckle down and pray even harder. So that's where we're going to end our study this week. I'm hoping that, this was a quick overview of our Bible study, which failed again this time. We're not very good at the tech part here, but we're going to get it figured out. Anyway, I'm hoping to see you again next week. We'll look at, again, Acts chapter 4. We're continuing in our story of the early church and how we should live. And it ties right in to what's going on in our history right now. So I hope to see you then. Thanks.